um, in an attempt to move a bit faster, which I never do, I'm probably going to record a couple of classes and put them online. They're done with a PowerPoint, and I think it's a more effective use of our time if I just do that at home, and you can watch the PowerPoint at home on your computers. So when that happens, I'll send out an email to the members of the class. So make sure that you have put your email address on in the book. I apparently didn't bring the book today, so there's papers out in the hall you can write your name on and hand it to Randy or I. We'll be talking about Abram today. We got started on him last week, and I wanted to make you aware of this book. This was printed by the Institute for the Study and Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts. For a while, they were called METI, Middle Eastern Text Initiative, and was a movement at BYU by some predominantly Arabic teachers who realized that many of the essential texts used in the Muslim world have never been translated into English. So how do you learn to talk to people if you're not even reading the same books? So BYU began publishing Arabic texts. Someone wrote in and said, you know, Hugh Nibley mentions a couple of books, and I have not been able to find them. Can you tell me where I can find these two ancient texts? And they went and looked and found neither of them had ever been translated into English. And so decided that's what we're going to do then, is make those texts available. The outgrowth of it was this book. As they looked at those two texts, they said, oh, there's a whole bunch of other texts that are of interest to us, particularly for the study of Abraham, the book of Abraham. And they've also either never been translated or are very hard to find. So collected in this volume are 125 different ancient texts that talk about Abraham. It's called Traditions About the Early Life of Abraham. And it's John Tibetness who started it, Brian Hoglid, and John Gee. And John is our current go-to guy for Abraham, Book of Abraham. Studies in the Book of Abraham. Yes?
Not only about the life of Abraham, but specifically every one of them relate to some part of the Book of Abraham as we have it that Joseph Smith had no access to. So all these facts that Joseph Smith is writing about Abraham, turns out that there are other documents in the Christian and Hebrew and Muslim worlds that refer to the same things.
Yeah, so it begins with a chart of about 22 items from the Book of Abraham that were not referenced in Genesis. So we learn a lot more about Abraham from the Book of Abraham than we learn from the 12, 14 chapters of Genesis. Different things that we learn. But those traditions have all, literally all, been found in the ancient documents. This is why someone has said, Joseph Smith either was inspired or is the very best guesser you'd ever meet because he's able to guess, right? Yeah. So, in fact, this is one of the charts on Islamic transmission of the text. You come back and let's see if I can find this is the list of things that we learn in the Book of Abraham that are not mentioned at all in the Bible. And then as you read the rest of the book, and I just marked in yellow the things I thought were interesting, You might find other things interesting, but what I thought I'd do is just pass this around. It costs you hundreds of dollars to buy this book now. It's been in print since, see, when did they first publish this? 2001. So it's been out 21 years, and it's no longer probably available unless you get it used or check it out from a library. So you may be able to get it through interlibrary loan. BYU library obviously has it. But that's one of the problems we have with really good scholarly stuff is if you don't find out about it within the first year and buy the book, you're out of luck because the printer's not going to print it again. There just isn't a large enough body of demand. And so I'll pass that around. Maybe you could take that back to Mary. Okay, so I believe last week we started talking about the language of covenant. Particularly, we went through in detail the words in the story of Noah. When we get to chapter 12 of Genesis is where we see Abram and Sarai, who are married in chapter 11. And that's chapter 11 is where it says that they leave Ur of Chaldees, and I hope you remember, Chaldea is an ancient name for the country of Babylon. And at the time of Abraham, Babylon was a backwater nothing. And so Chaldea as a name didn't exist. That will come later. So it's one of the place names that is clearly a later editor adding that in. The same was true, we talked about Dan. That's named for Abram's great-grandson, one of the 12 tribes, who was not alive at the time that it says he goes to Dan. Another one is Beersheba. It mentions him living at Beersheba before the story where Beersheba gets a name. And then they will go to Salem to meet Melchizedek, which is now called Jerusalem. So the map is just kind of help you figure out where they are and what the places mean and where you can see editing. The covenant, which is given in Genesis 12:1-3, talks about a land of promise. And it's when he gets to Shechem, which is this city that is now in Palestine. It's also called Sychar. And this is where Jacob built his well, dug a well. And in the New Testament, we will see Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well. That's in Shechem. Shechem is where Abram first dwells and builds an altar. And that altar will later be used by Joshua when they re-enter the Promised Land. And it's the homeland of the 12 tribes. That's where Joseph grew up, is in Shechem. And that is where Joseph's tomb is. When they brought his bones out of Egypt, they buried him in Shechem. And yet most members of the church have never heard of the town. Okay? It's northwest of Jerusalem, as I said, in Palestinian-held lands now. It's between two hills, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Shechem means a shoulder, so it's a raised piece of land between two higher hills. And they have the remnants of the old altars. You can see the ruins of those there. So that's really where he is given a promise of the land. And by building an altar, it's one way that you claim the land. Okay? By building an altar or a temple to your gods. And Abram does that in verse 7. He's told, to a land that I will show thee, I will make thy name great. I will make thee a great nation. I think I mentioned last week that the word there used for nation is goy, rather than Am. Am is the covenant name of Israel, meaning people. Nation is connected to a specific piece of land. And so an Egyptian, that's goyim. So connected to the land rather than to a group of other people. Am tend to be more nomadic. And you'll watch as God's people travel from place to place, but eventually come back to the Holy Land. And so it mentions land and seed, this great nation, that I will bless you and make thy name great. This is the same phrase that we saw back in Genesis 6, where it talked about the mighty men, men of renown, men having a great name or reputation. And I think this book is evidence of that. There is probably not another single person in the ancient world with as many stories told about him as Abraham. Part of that is because the three peoples of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all revere Abraham. And so you'll find traditions written about him in all three of those different religions. Those are the things that God said he's going to do. Land, seed, make your name great, bless you. And then, I think this is Abraham's part of the promise, and that is, thou shalt be a blessing. So rather than saying that as a prophecy, I read that as a command. Thou shalt be a blessing. In thee shall all the nations of the world be blessed. And that's how many Jews read that, and hence a lot of Jews will enter into fields where they can benefit other people. Field of law and defending any underdog, and medicine, and science. More Jewish Nobel Prize winners, more Jews than any other nationality or ethnicity. Okay, it was given in the context of marriage, and it has to do with family. And so we're told that because Abram's brother, and we've always talked about a man had two sons, right? Because his brother dies, that's Haran, he takes on Haran's son, who is Lot. Lot is Sarah's brother, if you haven't made that connection before. Later, we're going to see the contrast between Abram's descendants, Jacob, and his brother Nahor's son, which is Laban. And his sister is Rebecca. So you remember that genealogy we had last week. A man had two sons. So in verse 5, Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their substance that they had gathered and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth into the land of Canaan. The fact that they have people, souls, with them leads to a Jewish midrash that both of them had opened yeshivas. That's a way later Jewish word for a school. So a Jewish school where you teach and memorize Talmud. If any of you have seen Yentl, anybody seen Yentl? Okay, if you want to learn about Judaism, watch Yentl. It's fascinating. Orthodox Jews only sent the boys to school. And they not only would read the biblical text, but they would read the Talmud, the commentary on it, and memorize it and argue about it. And so that idea is read back onto Abram and Sarah, that each of them had opened schools in their tent. And so it's going to mention Sarah's tent about 3 times. You'll notice that Isaac, after his mother dies, he brings Rebekah to live at Sarah's tent. And Sarah's tent is considered to be the name of the school. Abram's teaching the men, Sarah's teaching the women, because you never have them together in school. That just isn't done. At least not until you get to the United States. And it was in 1833 that the town of Oberlin in Ohio founded a school, and it went bankrupt. But they got some funding from the Tappan brothers, who were radical abolitionists from Boston. If you've seen the movie Amistad, you meet one of the Tappans. And the Tappan brothers agreed to fund this now bankrupt school on the condition that they allow students of color, and this was the one that was hardest to pass through the board, women as students. And so that became the first coeducational college in the United States, 1835. And it's about 20, 30 miles away from Kirtland. It's interesting to read what's going on there at the exact same time as Kirtland is going on. So they take these converts with them, and the description of Shechem is that Abram pitches his tent on the plains of Moreh. That's verse 6. We're still in 12, Genesis 12. That they passed into the place of Shechem unto the plain of Moreh. Now, where you see the word plain, you want to put a line through it and write oak tree. The Hebrew word is Elah, and that's the Hebrew for a very strong tree, because El means strong. Now, it also means God, right? But most of the places that Abram goes are identified by an impressive tree that's growing there. And that way of identifying where people are will continue all the way through the book of Judges. Deborah dwells by a tree. Trees were scarce, and you weren't ever to cut them down. Even in a time of war, it's against the law, international law, for you to cut down your enemy's trees. A, they'll end up starving, or B, you're an idiot. It's going to take 20 years to grow new trees and get anything out of that land. If you want to conquer a people, leave the trees alone so that you'll be able to survive there as well. So these trees become location markers. Now, the King James translators are very uncomfortable with that, I believe, because tree worship was a part of ancient polytheism in the UK, in what is now the UK. When you think of Druids, etc., they had sacred trees. And so the King James guys are like, we're not going back there. We're not going to have people worshiping trees again. So they just took the tree out and say plains. And so when you watch videos, you see Abram out on some desolate plain with nothing around. At Shechem, he's between 2 mountains and under a huge tree. So you want to kind of change how you think about where he is. And verse 6 ends with, and the Canaanite was then in the land, which, of course, is later editing. Because if it was written at the time of Abraham, they wouldn't have said, Canaanites are in the land. Everyone would have known that. Then God says, I'm going to give you and your seed this land. And after he builds the altar up at Shechem, they get up and they move south, verse 8, they're going south to some other hills. And halfway between those two hills, a hill named Bethel and a hill named Ai. Now, you'll later read about Ai as a location where the children of Israel at the time of Joshua lost their first battle because somebody decided they liked the clothes in the home of one of the men that they had massacred. And they took the clothes home from battle and buried them underneath the floor of their tent. Because think about this. If you steal clothes from somebody in a different culture, can you wear those around your friends who know there's no store locally? Where did you get those clothes? So what's the point of having them? This is like people who buy illegal artwork. They can't show it to their friends. They have to keep it locked up somewhere hidden. That's just stupid. And so they lose the battle because this person was not obeying God's law, which was, don't take anything of theirs. You're not to profit from war. And somebody should have reminded Putin of that this week. So between Bethel and Ai, Abram builds an altar. And there he called upon the name of the Lord, or that can be read as he proclaimed the name of the Lord. So again, the question is he just praying for his own family and offering sacrifice, because that's what an altar would be for, or is he teaching the local people? That's what proclaiming is. And it's really fascinating to me that that is one of the things that Jesus says that he has done when he's checking in with his Father in John 17 in the great intercessory prayer at the end of the Last Supper. He said, I have proclaimed thy name unto those thou hast given me. How do you proclaim God's name? Just tell people what the right name is? Or live that name? Your actions teach about God. And so that's a concept we want to think a little bit about. They end up down in Beersheba, except it's not named Beersheba yet. That means well of the oath. And this is actually going to come up in chapter 21 when Hagar is driven out with her then adult son, Ishmael. He's at least 19 or 20 years old when they're kicked out of the house the second time. The first time she's pregnant, Hagar is pregnant. The second time she has a son. But every painting you've ever seen shows him as like a 7-year-old boy. Just like they have a young boy on the altar, Abraham sacrificing his son. Neither is true. Both men are adults by the time these stories are told. So Beersheba means the well of the oath, or where we swore an oath. And Sheba, which means oath, you see it there way down in the south, also means 7. So you'll often see people who will divide up the terms of the covenant into 7 terms, just because 7's the magic word. They will then go down into Egypt. Now, this is the first mention of Egypt. Although Egypt is an ancient country that's been there long before Abram and the Canaanites. Okay? Egypt goes way back. And part of the reason Egypt goes way back is because of the River Nile. Most places, including all of Because if you have been to the Holy Land and you look around over there in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, that's what it means, between the Tigris and Euphrates, it's desolate. And unless you have the water from the river, you don't get enough rainfall, and you can't live there. And I think this is an issue we're getting better acquainted with in Utah, of don't count on rain or snow being enough. And if you don't have massive rivers, you're crazy to keep building there. Because where's the water going to come from? And the River Nile is one of the great rivers of the world. And every year, the Nile flows north. I think you know that. And the headwaters of the Nile are in the mountainous country down in Africa, where it rains. And in flood season, the Nile will flood over its banks and carry soil that's been in that river all the way from Africa out and fertilize the land on both sides of the river. The country is sometimes just referred to as the river, because the entire country is just the people living along the edges of the Nile. But because it has this massive river, even if you are having a problem with famine, which means no rain, they still have water. So you will see over and over, not only Abram, but his descendants going down into Egypt because there's always water in Egypt. And that's the big draw, is getting the water out of Egypt. When they leave Egypt, they move to, Abram moves his tent to a place called Hebron. And Hebron becomes significant because that ends up being the only place that Abram ever owns any land. He's living on in these other places with the approval and okay of the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and you can read about them. There's about 10 different tribes that are in the land, and that he has to make covenants with about using their water. And so he's living there on the basis of them saying, okay, we'll share the water with you. These are the terms. But in Hebron, he buys a piece of land. And he purchases it for the reason that he needs to bury Sarah after she dies, which is chapter 23. And he wants to own that piece of land so that he has the right of return to that piece of land. There is a building there in Hebron today. It's called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. Sadly, our day to go and visit Hebron was supposed to be on a Wednesday, but because we had snow, our plane was delayed leaving New Jersey, and we didn't get there till Thursday, and you can't go to Hebron on Thursday because that's the day that the Muslims are at Hebron. And you don't go as a Christian or a Jew on the day that the Muslims are there because everybody worships, well, not worships, is proud of Abram. Abram is buried there and Sarah. Abram will be buried there by his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Now, you need to remember that Jews don't embalm. Embalming was going on in the ancient world. Certainly the Egyptians have been embalming people for thousands of years. And even to this day, many Jews do not get embalmed. They simply get buried the day after they die. And that shows great respect. What does that tell you about Ishmael? That he's there to bury his dad with Isaac. That these two brothers don't live very far away from each other. And they're communicating with each other. And they're agreeing with each other and working together. And that's not something that you ever hear about in Sunday school. Pretty much we say Hagar and Ishmael are driven out, and that's the last we ever mention them again. One of the things that I decided to do is I have a PowerPoint about Hagar and Ishmael and the birth of Islam among their descendants. And so I will record that and put it online so that if you're interested in knowing what the stories are that are told from a Muslim point of view about Abraham, Ishmael, and Hagar, you might find that interesting. So they moved to Hebron. Isaac is buried there. Rebekah is buried there. Jacob is buried there, and Leah. Not Rachel, because Rachel died someplace else. Just after her son Benjamin is born, the last of the 12 tribes, she dies. And so she is too far away from Hebron. They bury her where she was. So those are the 6, get the numbers correct, those are the 6 that are buried in the tomb of the patriarchs. You can go online and see pictures of the tomb. But what I find interesting is what Heber and Hebron means. It means to join or fasten together by an oath. I think it's one of the hints of eternal marriage, of a covenant between a man and wife that will extend beyond life. Abram wants to be with Sarah after death. He purchases the land that they can be buried together on. It also is the word that describes how the wings of the cherubim in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's tent. Let me check this. No, I didn't write down the reference. I think it's in Solomon's temple. Their wings join at the top. So it's joined together, but it's used in a temple context. So that's the land. Now we get to the stories. Now, as you talk about the stories about Abram, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. This is from the New Interpreter's Bible, 1994 edition. We should learn from the story of Abraham that receiving promises does not entail being protected from moments when those promises seem to be called into question. In other words, if you want the blessings of Abraham, you will have to live through the experiences that Abraham did. And there is in tradition a list called the 10 Trials of Abraham. Now, if you look that up, among other things, you can find a chart with about 12 different versions of this list, and every list is different. So they are collecting 10 stories out of that book, but they're not all the same. The book of Jubilees, has anyone ever read Jubilees? This is a book that was written about 130 years before the time of Jesus. So it is after the Jews have already kind of canonized what books are going in their scriptures, and Jubilees didn't make it. But it's a very interesting retelling of many of these stories as people understood them 150 years before the time of Jesus. So you may want to find Jubilees and read it. And Jubilees has a list of the 10 trials of Abraham in it. At around the same time, there was a rabbi who's, well, that's wrong. About 250 years later, because it's the end of the first century of the Common Era. If you're reading scriptural commentaries or history, you're not going to see AD and BC anymore. And the reason for this is those date to the birth of Christ. This is before Christ, and this is in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, and people who aren't Christians said, we're not using those terms anymore. We don't date to Jesus. Now, the irony is that's still the 0 date, okay? That's still 0 in all the calendars. But they have BCE and CE. CE stands for the Common Era, meaning from the birth of Christ on down. And BCE is before the Common Era. Okay, just so you can translate those. And it's helpful because this still has BC. So you know that's BC. CE is the Common Era. So in the first century CE, around the same time as Rabbi Akiva is a very famous rabbi you might want to learn about, lived someone named Rabbi Eleazar ben Hyrcanus. And he wrote a book. And when I say a book, oldest copies are on parchment on a scroll. Some contemporaneous copies were probably copied onto papyrus, and the pieces of papyrus sewn together in what we call a codex or a book, okay? And, but the chapters take about 1 page. So even if it has 40 chapters, it's not a very long book. But in antiquity, that was an impressive book. Because remember, they all have to be hand copied. And you either have to buy imported papyrus from Egypt, because it doesn't grow up in the Sea of Galilee or something. How many of you have seen papyrus growing? There is some at Red Butte Gardens. So if you ever want to see it, you can go to Red Butte Gardens. It's like a reed, and it has a little spray of tendrils out the top, like a little umbrella. It's interesting to see. And it's a very sticky pulp in the stem, and to make papyrus, they soak it, and then they lay it down and beat it with a paddle, beat it flat, then put another layer on going the opposite direction. So it has a checkerboard look to papyrus, if you've ever seen papyrus. So he wrote this book called The Chapters of Rabbi Eleazar, or Pirkei, P-I-R-K-E-I, Pirkei de Rabbi Eleazar. And that's available online. You can read it. Good luck. There is a lot of wandering around, and you wonder, is this person ever going to get to the point? Now, that was also true of some of the Jewish professors that I've had. They start off on some topic, and then they go from there on us, and you may notice I tend to do this as well, off on a side tangent and talk about this, and then another side tangent, and then something else. But eventually they get back to the point of the talk, and that's right at the end. And all of those side pieces connect with it in some way. And that's a very Jewish way to teach. And the first time I watched a professor teach like that, I thought, boy, he needs somebody to organize his notes better. But when I learned more about Judaism, I realized, oh, he is teaching us by teaching the way the ancient rabbis taught. It would be like going to conference and hearing Elder Bednar do a parable. Who is he copying? Well, Jesus. In the entire ancient world, there's nobody who tells parables better than Jesus. He is the #1 example of parables in all the nations. And I don't think we appreciate that. It's not easy to write a parable that really works. And often people will send you an email of some parable, and they all fail somewhere. Something in them that just doesn't work right. But pickles, parable of the pickle, that one's pretty good. So Rabbi Eleazar wrote this. And I think it's significant that the oldest copies that we have go back to the 9th century. It was first preserved in the Middle East and done by the people in the Middle East who were reading at the time, and that was Muslims. Many of the books that we use, like reading about Plato and Aristotle, we only have those copies because a bunch of pagans valued those copies because the writers were pagan. And they had them somewhere that the Catholic Church couldn't get their hands on them to burn them. And so when the Knights went on the Crusades to the Middle East, they found all these interesting books about stuff like math and science. And that's the beginning of the Enlightenment in the Western world, is the books that had been preserved by the Muslims. Keep them away from the Catholic Church that's going to burn everything that isn't a Bible. And I mean literally. They're going to burn everything that isn't a Bible. And so this book comes along. And there are 10 traditions. I'm going to go with Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And I may post that on my blog. That's the guardianguidanceday.blogspot.com that I wrote on the board earlier. I've kind of edited one just to pull out what I think are the most important pieces. So, number one trial of Abraham was at his birth. Now, what do we know about the birth of Abraham? Well, we know he came out of Ur of Chaldees. And the book of Abraham tells us that his father tried to kill him. But we don't have anything really about his childhood. Well, the stories told of his childhood are fascinating. Because Nimrod, anybody remember Nimrod? Where did we meet Nimrod? That was chapter 11. That's the Tower of Babel. He's a descendant of Cain, who is a mighty hunter. We talked about how he had the clothing from Adam, from Noah, that Ham copied and gave to Nimrod, who instead of covenanting with the animals as Adam did and naming them, and Noah did and saved them on the boat, Nimrod calls the animals to come and he kills them all for his own profit and becomes known as a mighty hunter. So it turns out that Nimrod gets a message or has a dream, just depends on the story you're reading, that a baby boy is going to be born who will replace him. Now, what story do you think of immediately? Herod, right? This story was written down before Herod. So who's copying whom? Who is noting that the same story is happening? That becomes one of the interesting questions of texts in antiquity. Which one was published first? Because they don't have a publishing date in the front. And we don't know when these books were being read, who had them, who didn't. And so he goes about, sends out his soldiers to kill every baby boy under the age of 2. Heard that one before? And so he also is sending out soldiers to find and kill all the pregnant women, because the baby has not yet been born. So the story is, this is Midrash, this is not true. Okay? My kids, when I'll talk about something, one will say, Mom, I think you need to distinguish for us between what is scriptural and what is not. And I'm thinking, well, you know the scriptures. You can tell what's scripture and what isn't. Apparently not in the moment. And that appears to be true of every class I've ever had as well. So what I did in the paper that I wrote up, and it looks like this, parallels between the lives of Abraham and Moses. Because if you read Josephus, which is an old history written about 150 years after the time of Jesus, Josephus is a Jew who decides, as much as he dislikes having the Romans come in and kill everybody and invade his country and take over, he doesn't want to die for it, so he goes to work for the Romans. And his books, Antiquities of the Jews, the other one is something, the campaigns, the wars, that's it, the wars. He writes those for the benefit of the Romans. And in that set of stories, he tells that Pharaoh was really worried because he was told that a baby boy was going to be born who would replace him. And so he has all the baby boys killed, which of course is a biblical story. But it isn't about Pharaoh being replaced individually in the Bible. In the Bible, he's worried about the nation of the Jews rising up against the nation of Egypt. Either way, baby boys are going to get killed. And Josephus says that when his daughter brings home this baby boy from the river, Pharaoh, the baby plays with things that he finds in the throne room, just entertaining. Babies do that, they go and investigate. And one of the things that he takes and plays with is Pharaoh's crown. And he's more fascinated with playing with the crown than he is with playing with a ball. And Pharaoh's magicians interpret that this kid is going to become a great leader who may dethrone Pharaoh. Now, that's how Josephus tells the story. But that same story is being told in old documents about Abram as a threat to the kings. Okay? And you really will see religion, righteous people, as a threat to men in power. This week we heard about a film that we hadn't seen. The events occurred while we were on our mission, so we hadn't really paid a lot of attention. It's called Winter on Fire. Is that it, Randy? Winter on Fire. And it's the revolution in Ukraine as the people in Ukraine rise up against their president, their king, who is a close friend of Putin and who is very oppressive and is taking away all their rights. 2013 to 2014. And for 90 days, the citizens of Ukraine are out in the streets of Kyiv demonstrating. And they call in, of course, the kings, the presidents, the oligarchs, call in the army and mercenaries to massacre them. And, as we were watching it, A, I'm crying, and B, I'm thinking, was Putin not paying attention? Even grandmas were out fighting against his friends in 2014. Everybody was fighting. They aren't going to take this. And that's what's happening now. It's been a week, and it was only supposed to take a couple of days. And this is not what the oligarchs want, what the wealthy, what the kings want. This is the people. And you see the Orthodox priests on which side? On the side of the people. It's very interesting to watch them out standing with their staffs between the police and the protesters, saying, stop killing. But they could all very easily have been shot right there and then. So we're always going to see this conflict. And so the number one thing that happens is that Sarah goes and hides in a cave and gives birth to Abram there. And he stays in that cave, in a house in the earth, is the text, for 13 years. And when he comes out, he sees the sun and the moon and the stars, and he sees other people who are worshiping those, but he's lived for years without them. He knows that those are not the gods. And so the idea is that at the age of 13, he discovers who the true one God is that has protected him. Now, 13 is the age at which boys get circumcised. That's the age that Ishmael was circumcised within Islam. In Judaism, it'll be 8 days. In Islam, it's the age of 13. The second trial, so he breaks all the images, breaks the idols, etc. You've probably heard about the breaking of the idols. The second trial is that he is put into prison for 10 years, and then when he comes out of prison, they build a huge fire and throw him into it. Now, the fire is so hot that it kills the people trying to haul Abram into the fire. What story is that? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego from the book of Daniel. These stories get told over and over again. Now, it's also Daniel in the lion's den, because furnace or fire is ur, which means light. That's spelled like this. That's city or light. These are two different ways to make an A. This is an O or a U. This is an R. And so Abram comes from a city named City, or a city named Light, or a city named, and using this one that means light, a city named Lion, because or also means lion. And so he is thrown to the lions. Well, if you look in Abraham, book of Abraham, you find the king of Egypt having Abram killed, and where does he have him laying? On a lion couch. Now, is he thrown into a furnace, or is he thrown to the lions, or is he killed on a lion couch, or? All of them are the stories told. The scriptures, like Nehemiah, says, "Thou art the Lord God, Jehovah Elohim, who didst choose Abraham and brought him forth out of the furnace of the Chaldees." Now, in our translation, it just says Ur of Chaldees, but you can translate it as furnace. So, the third trial is leaving his parents' home. That's the Lech Lecha of chapter 12, verse 1, which opens with going, go, or get going and go, Abram. And it's interesting because every time Abram gets up and goes, even before it mentions who he takes or what he takes with him, he's already gone. He just goes. It's a lot like that moment that we all know where why are you doing what you're doing, Adam? And he said, I have no clue. I just have learned to obey God. And Abram apparently is just going to obey God. So the third trial then is to leave his parents' home and follow this map. And he goes to Haran, which is named for his brother who dies, and then they head south. And they end up in Egypt because the fourth trial is the famine. Now, the rabbis will say this is the very first famine in the history of the world. Now, Abram, we would date to about 1800 BCE. Okay? There are actually structures in Israel to this day that were built at that point in time. That's as many years before Jesus as we are after Jesus. These are really, really old buildings. But that's about the date for Abram. Had there ever been a famine in the world prior to that? Well, probably. But it doesn't get mentioned in the Bible, and therefore it didn't happen. Okay? If you're a really strict biblical interpreter and you believe every word of the Bible is the history of the world, then anything that doesn't get mentioned in the Bible probably didn't happen. And maybe that's a way we can talk to our kids about not everything in history ends up in history books. Not every righteous person ends up having their story told in the church news. There's a lot of stuff going on that just never made it into the books that you have, that you're reading. And that's important to remember. But because of the famine, where are they going to go? Where do you go when there's no rain? You go to Egypt. Because Egypt has that river, and there's going to be food there. So Abram and Sarah go down into Egypt. And the fifth trial occurs when Pharaoh sees Sarah. Now, I don't know how you want to deal with the ages of Abram and Sarah. At this point, she's at least in her 50s. He's at least in his 60s. But she is the single most beautiful woman in the world in the ancient text. She's like Helen of Troy. And over and over, well, at least twice, we're going to see foreign kings wanting her to be their wives, part of their harem. Now, there's two things going on here. One is men wanting a woman they can't have. That hasn't changed. And two is, if you marry somebody's sister or daughter, that's one way you make a treaty with them. Because you've got their grandkids living at your house, and the two of you are not going to fight if you have family members that you've exchanged. And there you have, in a nutshell, the royalty of Europe. Because every country in Europe is marrying the sons and daughters of all the other kings of all the other countries of Europe. My dad said, Queen Elizabeth's husband isn't English, he's German. And this Mountbatten, his uncle, that's just taking the German Battenberg and translating it into English, Mountbatten. They're all Germans. And it helps you understand a little better why they might go for appeasement. Because those are their relatives. Yeah, they're doing terrible things, but hey, they're our relatives. And that's how treaties are made. So the question is, does Pharaoh want Sarah just because she's so darn pretty? Well, the only way he's going to get her is to kill her husband. Unless she's not a married woman. If she's his sister, well, we'll just make a treaty between us. I'll marry your sister, I'll give you my daughter. And so the tradition is that Pharaoh gave Abram his daughter named Hagar, that she's the daughter of Pharaoh, and that she's in exchange for Sarah. Now, that's not how we do things anymore. But it was certainly true during the life of Moses, which is about 600 years after Abraham, as he gets a wife that Miriam and Aaron are harassing him about. What about that wife of yours who is from Sheba? And he says, hello. And so Josephus tells the tradition, Moses is leading Pharaoh's army in battle against the people down in Sheba. That's Ethiopia, near the headwaters of the Nile. And one of the princesses looks out over the walls of the city and sees the leader in that chariot, and he's cute. So she turns to her dad and says, why don't we just not have a war? I'll just marry him. That's fine with me. And so they have peace because she marries Moses. Now, that's kind of a subtext running through here that is not the first thing we think of. What's the first thing we think of when Abram says to Sarah, tell them you're my sister. We think Abram is lying. But if Lot is his brother, and we accept that, and he really isn't, it's his nephew, his brother's son, Sarah is just the same relation. That's his niece, his brother's daughter, and we're okay with saying that Lot's his brother, but not with Sarah as his sister? Our problem gets to be that we're living in our day, judging these people by our standards. And we don't know what their customs were. Unless you go back and spend years reading about their customs, which may or may not be of interest to most people. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating is that the night that Pharaoh takes Sarah, they will say in the book, Sarah was taken on Passover. And so Pharaoh is afflicted with plagues. Wait a minute, when does Passover happen? That's during the life of Moses. This is 600 years later. Okay. But Pharaoh is plagued. He's unable to perform sexually, and so obviously never touched Sarah. That needs to be a part of the story so that everyone knows Sarah's okay. Abram has not been dishonored here. And Abram leaves not only with the daughter of Pharaoh, whose name will be known as Hagar, but also with great wealth, which is exactly what happens at the end of the Exodus. After Pharaoh is plagued, Moses leaves with the sister of Pharaoh, or the daughter of the Pharaoh who knew Joseph. This is the one who drew Moses out of the water. It's his mom. Did you know that she left Egypt with Moses? See, we don't read carefully enough. It's in Chronicles. And she marries one of the Israelites and takes a new name. Because taking a new name when you change your status was a part of the ancient world. And apparently part of Native American culture. That when you achieve something great, you might get a new name for it. And so she takes a new name. Her new name is Bithia, which means daughter of Jehovah. Now, that would not have been the name Pharaoh gave her, right? Because he doesn't believe in that God. So the fact that she has taken this name tells you she's converted. And that's Bithia. Now, you end up with a triplet of this story. We're going to see Sarah wanted by Pharaoh in Genesis 12. Then we're going to watch in Genesis 20 where Abimelech, who lives up near Hebron and Beersheba, takes Sarah. And then we will see in Genesis 26 that Abimelech takes Rebekah from Isaac. Now, did this really happen 3 times? Are these 2 women so absolutely drop-dead gorgeous that even in their 70s and 80s, it's enough to have a war over? And Abimelech, if he's taking Sarah long before Isaac is even born, is this the same king who takes Rebekah years later? Or is Abimelech a dynastic name like King Laman? And in the Book of Mormon, we have to put Laman 1, Laman 2, Nephi 1, Nephi 2, Nephi 3, Nephi 4, dynastic names. And are all 3 of these historically occurring events? We honestly don't know. My own reading of it is maybe one of them, but certainly not 3 times. So you want to say, why was this story kept? What's the story trying to say? It's, for me, it's, does God keep his covenant with his covenant people? That even when something terrible happens, like somebody's wife gets kidnapped, God plagues those people so that her honor is preserved and she comes home and they are benefited. They become rich through these experiences. That's a weird story. And probably not one you're going to tell at family night. Okay? Now, as they come out of Egypt, they have Hagar. This is Hagar. This is how you spell it, with a hey, a gimel, and a resh. But it's not really a name. Wait, let's get to 16, because this is where we really meet Hagar. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an handmaid. Now, if you look down, you'll notice in verse 3, it says, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land. That 10 years is going to define for the rabbis, Orthodox rabbis even to this day, how many years you give a wife to have a child before you decide she's not fertile. And if after 10 years, and this is true in Orthodoxy, like Chabad, Lubavitcher Jews, and ultra-Orthodox, if you haven't yet had a child, you have to divorce that first wife and marry someone else. Because God commanded men to multiply and replenish the earth. And if your wife can't have kids, you have to divorce her and marry somebody else in order to keep that commandment. Now, of course, where my head goes is, well, what if it's not her fault? What if he's the one shooting blanks, right? Nowhere in the history of the world does anyone imagine that men who can perform sexually are not fertile. Obviously, it's not their fault. So when you look at somebody like Henry VIII, who we know had syphilis, and we know was not fertile for a long time or had issues with that, it's not all those wives' fault. If you're marrying 6 different women and none of them are giving you kids, might you question if it's the guy? That's never going to come up as a possibility. So after 10 years, you're expected to divorce the first wife and remarry unless you're living where having more than one wife is acceptable. And in the ancient world of Abram's time, it's acceptable to have more than one wife. And so Sarah gives Hagar to Abram. She had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. That's verse 1 in chapter 16. So this is the word for handmaiden. It's shifcha. Sorry, that should be open there. Shifcha. And the noun made out of that, if we put an M on the front, becomes mishpacha, which is the modern Hebrew word for family. So each handmaiden is the beginning of a new family. So in essence, Jacob has 4 families because he has 4 wives, right? Now, Egyptian, they have mentioned that they went to Egypt. This is the first well, we also mentioned Pharaoh, but that's how you spell Egyptian, and it's the same word as Egypt. That's Mitzrayim. But what we almost all miss is what it says in, verse 1, Abram's wife, Sarai, gave Hagar. Verse 3, gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. We'll say she's a concubine, she's a handmaiden, she's whatever else. No, the text says they're both wives. Isha, the same word that's used of Adam and Eve, Ish and Isha, as they're now like equals. And we need to see her as having more power and place in that home. And it's clear through the story that Abram thinks of her as his wife and loves Ishmael, her son. Sarah has a different opinion, because before she was a wife, she was a handmaiden, which is a slave. And so we come up against this issue of slavery in the Old Testament. And slavery is not easy for us to talk about because we don't want to see any of our great leaders as slaveholders. We do quite a fancy dance to get away from the fact that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both owned slaves, that Jefferson has a significant number of descendants through a slave that he kept in his house in Monticello, almost as a prisoner. And in France, yes. So that is such a terrible thing in our culture that we don't even want to talk about it. Or how do we get rid of them because they had this attitude towards slavery? Well, folks, all the way down through the entire New Testament, Paul never tells people to sell their slaves, right? He says, slaves, obey your masters. And masters, be kind to your slaves. But there's no command from God saying, sell the slaves. In the ancient world, almost everything that you could produce required human labor. They just didn't have machines and factories and et cetera. And so, like in the southern United States, you just needed people to get out there and pick that cotton or the tobacco or whatever. And if you didn't have enough people to do that, you couldn't have that industry. And that's true of the entire ancient world. When you talk about Greece and democracy, I've seen estimates that only 3% of Greeks, of the people living in Greece, were citizens in the democracy. It was only men, and it certainly wasn't all their slaves. So we need to kind of redefine how we think about what democracy is for us versus in the ancient world. So it's hard, but we need to come to terms with slavery. There are 3 classes, social classes. One is free men. That's men who've never been in slavery. Then freed men, men who were in slavery but have been freed, either purchasing their freedom or having an owner who manumitted them, gave them their freedom. And the third class is slaves. You'll notice it doesn't mention women anywhere because they don't even come into the discussion. Women aren't mentioned in any of the social classes, only the men. And even in the US, the slaves, ex-slaves, the freed men, are going to be able to vote before women do. It's a different world out there. And trying to impose our way of doing things and how we see things on the ancient world is not helpful. Okay? So I had this paper that I did. What I'll do is I'll have her put this up. This is a list of parallels between Abram and Sarah and their experience in Egypt and Moses' experience in Egypt. And I found 16 places where the same thing happened for each of them. Now, you need to make sure that you can see this. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them in the list about Abram are midrash, made up ways to tell the story where the rabbis want Abram to look a lot more like Moses. So they're going to tell his story using the same words. So we've got all of that. The 6th trial, did we do 5? Let me go back and make sure. Yes, Sarah taken by Pharaoh. Now between that trial, coming out of Egypt, and the 6th trial, which is Abram going to rescue Lot in war, having to go to war, we have the introduction of Lot living in the same land with Abram. They've come out of Egypt rich. They each have tons of animals to feed, and there's not enough fodder or water to have all their flocks in the same area. So Abram takes him and says, okay, what part do you want? I'll take the rest. And Lot opts to choose that fertile watered plain over southeast of the Dead Sea, near the city of Sodom. He says, that looks good, I'll take that. So that's where he goes. And that begins all his problems. Now, he's been with Abram all the way through all the rest. But now we're going to see him as a contrast. Abram as being willing to work harder, live on land that's not as good, give the other brother more. I don't know, you've all heard that great story about there's 2 brothers, they're both farmers, one of them's married, has a whole big family, the other one's a single guy. And the single guy at Christmas thinks, you know, I have so much stuff, and my brother, he's got so many more kids to support, he needs more of my crop. So he secretly takes and puts food in his brother's barn. Meanwhile, his brother says, you know, I have all the blessings. I have all these kids. My brother doesn't have any of that. I can't give him kids, but I could give him more food for his stock. So he takes food out of his barn and takes it over to his brother. Okay? So we often will see these stories that are told of 2 brothers. And of course, that's kind of like O. Henry, right? The gift of the Magi. Here you're seeing one of the brothers is just like that, give you whatever you need, and the other one will take it. But we never see Lot helping Abram. Okay? There isn't a reciprocity here. When you're hiding from each other, hauling food to each other's barns, that's kind of like Zion. You know, there's no poor, because we don't define ourselves as poor, and we'll give other people whatever they need. But Lot it's a different direction. And Lot, by the way, means wrapped in a cloak or veiled. That's what his name means. And I think that he may have this name just because he doesn't really see what's going on. He's not paying attention. And pitches his tent toward Sodom and doesn't seem to see the wickedness that is in Sodom and how it's going to affect his family. And so he gets taken when the 4 kings attack the 5 cities of the plain in chapter 14. And verse 12, they took Lot, Abram's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and all his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre. He lives under this tree. Everybody knows where you can find him. And the one who escaped, they've made up this really interesting story that I think as Mormons, we really would appreciate this story. Other people, maybe not so much. But they say there's one who escaped when Satan and his angels were fighting the war in heaven. They tried to pull as many righteous out with them to fall to the earth. This is like the fall in chapter 6. The Nephilim, the giants who, anyway. And that Michael is one that they are trying to drag out of heaven. But Jehovah reaches down and grabs Michael's wing, and he escapes from Satan's grasp, and thus it's Michael who goes to tell Abram that Lot has been captured. Now, that's a long song and dance. There's no proof of any of that. But they're looking for a way to connect Abram with the great army that God has. And Michael, the archangel, is one of the greats in that army. Now, we, as members of the church, will have Michael, Adam, in the same list in section 138 that gets down to Abram, the father of the faithful, right? And also in that list, and I didn't bring, but there are scriptures here, so I'm okay. If you turn to section 138, you'll see that list, and nobody else besides members of the church believe that Michael was the pre-existent name for Adam. For everyone else, Michael is an archangel, the top archangel in God's army of angels, because they believe angels are a separate type of being, not quite God, but not human either. Some kind of semi-divine being with wings. The wings won't come in until about the time of Persia. And the Persians have demons and etc. that have wings. And so that's where we first get wings mentioned in the story. But we're the only ones who believe that angels are simply people at a different point in their eternal plan of salvation scheme of things. Maybe they haven't been born yet. Maybe they have lived on earth and were translated. Maybe they're resurrected beings. But the word for angel, I did write it down on here, is malak. Now, it's spelled with an M-L-K, but with an aleph stuck right in there, malak. This is the same word as melech, which is king, and we're going to meet Melchizedek, a righteous king, who is a priest over to the Most High God. Malak gets translated into Greek as angelos, because malak means messenger, and angelos is the Greek word for messenger. And you want to think in your head, who's the Greek messenger of the gods. That's Mercury, who's got the hat with the wings and the sandals with the wings, and he's carrying a caduceus, the snakes, and there's 2 wings. And so they're connecting wings with messengers. But there isn't another category. And I've several times had people say, so what does the Hebrew have to tell you about angels? I'm really interested in angels. And it's usually somebody who's been listening to Elder Holland who talks about how there's angels around us to help us. Like there's something other than people. And honestly, when you see angels come, messengers come, like this one, there's nothing to suggest he's anything but a human being. I like to take and think where it says Malak, it could be a Malak Sedek, a righteous messenger that God has sent, and that would be a Melchizedek priesthood holder who is sent to take care of somebody that God has made covenants with, like Abram and Lot. And so the message is sent. It might be from another ward. So the list, of course, in 138, where we were going, starts with our father Adam, the Ancient of Days, our glorious mother Eve, with her many faithful daughters. There's all the women in the list. One of them is named. Abel, the first martyr. Seth, one of the mighty ones. That's the same term used of that other group, the sons of God who married the daughters of men, the mighty ones. Noah, who's one of the mighty ones, because his name was Gabriel, and that means mighty man of God. Noah, who gave warning of the flood. Shem, the great high priest. Abram, the father of the faithful. Oh, wait a minute. Who's the great high priest in the Bible? That's Melchizedek. And so Joseph Smith taught that Melchizedek is a title for Noah's son Shem. And that really Shem is kind of like the prophet, the president of the church at the time of Abram. He's living in Salem, which Abram has gone past back and forth often, and Abram has offered things on an altar at Moriah, which is the mountain that the temple, part of the Temple Mount, in what will later be known as Jerusalem. And that's where Melchizedek is. So Abram goes with 318 of his men, in verse 14, 318 men born in his house, which, if you have that many army men, you must have at least 2,000 people who are part of your household. Abram is more like a stake president hauling his entire stake with him everywhere he's going. So when you see movies and there's Abram and Sarah and they're living in a tent and they have 2 servants and Hagar, which the latest movie that I saw made, that's about how many people they had. You need to step back from that and say, oh, I don't think so. He's like a king. And he takes his men and they go up and they rescue Lot. And as they come back south, heading home, they stop in Salem because they went up past Dan to rescue him up here in this area, heading towards Damascus, which is over here. And he comes back home and he pays his tithes to Melchizedek. Now the Jews will say, very first person to ever pay tithing is Abram. Okay, it's the first one that gets mentioned in the Old Testament, but probably there is a financial law of the Lord from the very beginning. And Melchizedek comes forth with bread and wine. We read that and say, prefiguring the sacrament, which is fine. But in the ancient world, what it says is Melchizedek is showing hospitality. He is filling his obligation toward strangers and foreigners and other people who might be passing through. You're obligated to feed them. It's not an option. And there's actually three groups that have special attention from God. And that is, the widows, almanah, the fatherless, and the strangers in the land. Those are the people who can go to the temple and ask for food, and the priests will feed them. And the only way they'll have food to give them is if you've paid your tithing, because the priests don't have any land, right? So there must be some kind of tithing if you're going to, or first fruits, or some rule, if you're going to meet their needs. And I find it fascinating in chapter 16 that when Hagar, she has become pregnant, she's given as a wife, she leaves Abram's house. She leaves as Hagar. Widow means a woman bereft. It doesn't mean a widow. It means a woman who doesn't have a man obligated to take care of her. She's not living in a man's home. And orphan is not an orphan. It's somebody who doesn't have a dad. And even in India today, many of the orphans in orphanages are children who have at least a mom, but they can't take care of them. And so she's got a fatherless child in her womb. She is a woman with no man to protect her. She is a foreigner in the land, and God sends the very first angel in the Old Testament text to take care of Hagar. I think it was a Melchizedek priesthood holder, rather than some semi-divine winged being. And through the entire text, those three classes that Hagar represents will have special rules that if you are a covenant maker, you are under covenant to take care of those people. Get into Deuteronomy, and it talks about that. So in this video that I might make about Hagar, I'll try to talk about why an angel comes. So this brings us down to chapter 15 of Genesis, which I also might do a video on, because that's another hour and a half, just for chapter 15. And it's about Abram and Jehovah renewing their covenants with each other. And it uses the phrase in verse 18, in that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, or cut a covenant with Abraham. It's a ceremony that is bizarre to us, and understanding that ceremony will help you to see how covenants are made in the Old Testament and what the symbolism is in that covenant making. And that's trial number 7. So the covenant. Okay. There is so much that can be said about Abram. You've seen that book. 125 books about Abraham from the ancient world. He's an important guy. But I want to return to what we started with, and that was that quotation. We should learn from the story of Abraham that receiving promises does not entail being protected from moments when those promises seem to be called into question. But Abram becomes the father of the faithful, and it is his faith in God. In spite of all these trials, he remains faithful. That's what Abram will be known for the most in all the stories. That we might be like Abram in that way and remain faithful through our trials is my prayer for us. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. And we have Nolette.